Bashar al-Assad's rise to power seemed improbable. A mild-mannered ophthalmologist, Bashar was thrust into the Syrian political spotlight after the untimely death of his brother Basil. In 2000, Bashar inherited not just the Syrian presidency, but also a legacy of ruthless governance. Yet his two-decade rule of the country would see the collapse of this carefully constructed dynasty as Syria descended into one of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century. Bashar's journey begins with his father Hafez al-Assad, a shrewd and calculating military officer who seized power in a bloodless coup in 1970. Hafez became prime minister and in 1971 was elected president. His rule was marked by an iron grip on power maintained through a blend of brutal repression, political cunning, and patronage. He consolidated his power through alliances with key military and intelligence figures while promoting a secular nationalist ideology. Hafez's presidency was characterized by dramatic displays of authoritarianism. In 1982, his forces crushed an Islamist uprising in the city of Hama, killing tens of thousands and sending a chilling message to opponents. Meanwhile, his foreign policy elevated Syria's regional influence, aligning with the Soviet Union, meddling in Lebanon's civil war, and backing militant groups like Hezbollah to enhance Syria's strategic reach. For much of Hafez's rule, the presidency's future lay with his eldest son, Bashar al-Assad. Charismatic, athletic, and a decorated military officer, Bashar was widely seen as the perfect successor. His public image was carefully curated by state propaganda, positioning him as a modernizer and the symbol of Syria's future. But in 1994, tragedy struck. While speeding to Damascus airport, Bashar's car crashed, killing him instantly. His death left the Assad dynasty in disarray. President Hafez, nearing the end of his life, turned reluctantly to his second son, Bashar, an unassuming ophthalmologist living in London, far removed from the corridors of power in Damascus. Quiet, studious, and largely apolitical, he had spent years training as a doctor, specializing in ophthalmology. Following Bashar's death, Hafez al-Assad summoned Bashar back to Syria and set about grooming him for leadership. Bashar underwent military training and was rapidly promoted through the ranks. His rise showed his father's strong commitment to keeping the Assad dynasty alive. When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, Bashar was thrust into the presidency. Although many Syrians objected to the transfer of power from father to son, Bashar's ascent engendered some optimism both in Syria and abroad. At just 34 years old, many Syrians and international observers hoped Bashar, with his Western education and softer demeanor, might reform the country's authoritarian system. The early years of Bashar's rule, marked by the so-called Damascus Spring, saw a brief opening of political and social freedoms as intellectuals and activists called for change. However, Syria became a tightly controlled police state, with dissent crushed and opposition voices silenced. Yet Bashar played a double game, cultivating an image of a reformer while using brutal tactics to ensure loyalty. Behind the scenes, his regime was a labyrinth of corruption, cronyism, and military dominance. Around this time, his country's ties with the United States deteriorated further after Assad publicly condemned the United States-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. His speeches increasingly featured nationalist and anti-Western themes, which became a hallmark of his rhetoric. Assad also played a pivotal role in Iran's axis of resistance, granting Iranian military forces extensive freedom to operate across the region from Iran to Lebanon. He meddled in Lebanese politics, supported militant groups like Hezbollah, and aligned with Iran, securing Syria's dominance in the Middle East. By the late 2000s, Bashar seemed untouchable, ruling with an iron fist while presenting a polished, media-friendly facade. But beneath this facade, cracks were forming. Economic mismanagement, rising inequality, and public frustration simmered under the surface. By 2011, discontent with Bashar's rule was reaching a boiling point. Syrians faced rising inequality, rampant corruption, and the effects of Bashar's neoliberal economic reforms, which disproportionately benefited urban elites at the expense of rural communities. The spark came in March 2011 during the wave of Arab Spring protests sweeping the Middle East. In the southern Syrian city of Daraa, security forces arrested and brutally tortured a group of teenagers who had scrawled anti-government graffiti. The treatment of these teenagers enraged the local population, sparking protests that quickly spread across the country.
Well, in Syria, the president there has promised to consider reforms after a week of violent protests in the southern city of Daraa. But that hasn't stopped protesters who've called for countrywide demonstrations on Friday. Thousands of people were on the streets on Thursday to mourn people who say were shot during the government's crackdown. There are reports.
Bashar al-Assad's response was swift and ruthless. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators and mass arrests ensued. What had begun as a peaceful protest movement soon escalated into an armed rebellion as opposition groups took up arms against the regime. This would soon evolve into the brutal Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War became one of the most complex and devastating conflicts of modern times, involving a multitude of factions and international powers. In the war, the Assad regime relied on loyalist military units, secret police and militias supported heavily by Russia and Iran. Russia's intervention, marked by relentless airstrikes, helped turn the tide in Assad's favor. Meanwhile, Iran provided weapons, funding and fighters, including Hezbollah militias. As part of the opposition forces, a diverse coalition of groups, including the secular Free Syrian Army and Islamist factions, fought against Assad. However, infighting and competing agendas weakened their efforts. In this Syrian war, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar backed various rebel groups, each pursuing its own interests. Also exploiting the chaos, ISIS emerged as a formidable force, seizing territory in Syria and Iraq by 2014. Their brutality shocked the world, drawing global attention and military intervention. Another group, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, established a semi-autonomous region in northern Syria. Backed by the United States, they became a crucial ally in the fight against ISIS. Bashar al-Assad's regime has been accused and widely reported to have used chemical weapons during the Syrian Civil War. However, his government consistently denied using these chemical weapons, blaming the attacks on rebels or labeling them as fabrications. Substantial evidence, including chemical residue analysis and eyewitness accounts, implicated his regime. Against all odds, Bashar al-Assad clung to power. With Russian airstrikes and Iranian militias tipping the balance, his regime regained lost territory. By 2020, Bashar controlled most of Syria, though the country lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed, the economy collapsed, and millions of Syrians lived in exile or in desperate poverty. Meanwhile, opposition forces maintained control over the northwest, and Kurdish groups held sway in Syria's northeast. Despite enduring severe Western sanctions that kept Damascus under economic pressure, regional nations began to acknowledge Assad's continued grip on power. In 2023, the Arab League restored Syria's membership, and in May of this year, Saudi Arabia took a significant step by appointing its first ambassador to Damascus in over a decade, marking a thaw in relations after a 12-year rift. As we all know by now, the geopolitical landscape shifted rapidly when opposition forces in northwest Syria launched an unexpected offensive in late November 2024. This swift advance overwhelmed Assad's government troops, who quickly crumbled under pressure.
Just 12 miles from the presidential palace in Damascus, crowds chant for Bashar al-Assad's regime to fall, a statue of his father becoming the latest to topple. The dynasty's iron grip on Syria this week loosening at breakneck speed. The Syrian government is facing an onslaught from north and south. The so-called rebels, led by the Islamic group HTS, closing in on the strategic city of Homs, seizing the spoils of abandoned army outposts.
Meanwhile, Assad's key allies, distracted by other conflicts, such as Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine and the ongoing battles between Israel and Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, showed little inclination to intervene decisively. In the early hours of Sunday 8 December 2024, reports began to emerge that Bashar al-Assad had fled Syria via Damascus International Airport. After more than 54 years in power, the Assad dynasty crumbled, leaving a nation shattered by conflict.
Opposition forces have declared the end of President Bashar al-Assad's rule after 13 years of civil war. Well, earlier, Reuters News reported that the leader, who ruled for 24 years, had actually left the capital, Damascus. A few hours ago, rebel forces had announced they'd entered Damascus. They also said they'd taken over the city's airport and the state TV building. The Syrian Prime Minister says the government was ready to hand over power to any leadership chosen by the people.
For Syrians, the fall of the Assad dynasty marks the end of one chapter, but not the end of their struggles. Let me know in the comments below what you think the future holds for Syria. Don't be shy to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. See you soon for another episode of The Knowledge Quest.